Hello, I'm Tom, and thank you for purchasing one of our MP600 centrifugal oil separators from Separator Spares International. I'd like to welcome you to our training video where I'll take you through a step-by-step guide to the service and cleaning procedure. The first thing to remember is that we need to isolate the high pressure oil supply. So we need to either turn the engine off or use an isolation valve if you've got one fitted. The second thing I would recommend is to use some gloves to protect your hands, and then we can start the process of disassembling. First thing we need to do is remove the band clamp by turning in an anti-clockwise direction until it becomes loose. When it's loose enough, we can then just remove the T-bolt and slide the band clamp over the flange or onto the desk or table. We can then start to loosen the cover assembly. These are left-hand threaded, so we need to turn this clockwise to start removing. Keep turning until you hear a little clonk, and then you can remove the cover assembly. So now we need to remove the bowl assembly off the housing. The best thing to do is just lift slightly just to make sure any remaining oil drains out of the bowl assembly before then lifting the complete bowl assembly off the spindle and into a dirty area ready for cleaning. One other thing to be aware of is just to check the O-ring on the body housing assembly, just to make sure there's no cracks or it's not brittle, otherwise you can leave it. We're now going to start the bowl disassembly, and for this we'll need some tools. So we'll need a mallet, we'll need a hook spanner, we'll need some wrenches, a 3mm Allen key, and then we'll need some sort of wooden or nylon tool so that we can remove the sludge from inside the separator. Okay, to disassemble the bowl assembly we should lie it down horizontal. We should take our wrenches. Again, we have a left-hand thread on the bowl assembly, so we put the wrenches on and turn in a clockwise direction and loosen the cover nut until you can now use your hand to remove the cover nut. There's also a washer under here that you should keep. Lie the bowl assembly down, and then we will need the mallet. Hold your hand on the top of the bowl wall, and we use the mallet to try and remove the distributor plate. Okay, we can now stand the unit back up and remove the bowl wall and the top turbine, being careful because you have lots of sludge and oil inside. We can then remove the top turbine, and we have it in 3 different sections. Okay, now we've got the distributor plate with the bowl discs and bearing tube open. We now don't need to actually clean the bowl discs. They're designed so that all the sludge doesn't stick onto them. But one thing we should do is just check the O-ring at the top, make sure there's no damage, make sure it's not brittle, otherwise it will need to be replaced. If the sludge for any reason goes into the bowl discs, then you may need to remove them. The way to do this is just to slide them off the top. You can then clean and wash, and you can use a Biogen active product, making sure that we don't use anything abrasive which can damage the smooth nature of the bowl discs. You can then replace. So now we need to disassemble the top turbine. We need a 3mm Allen key just to undo these 8 screws. Okay, now we've removed the 8 bolts. We can then remove the plate where we have the top turbine. We then need to remove the mesh supports, take the mesh out of the unit, and this can be disposed of. We must also remove the O-ring from the top turbine, ready for cleaning. Okay, now we need to start the cleaning. Just wipe around the base of the distributor. Any bits of sludge that have collected, please use a wooden tool or nylon tune so we don't damage the aluminium. And we can remove the deposited sludge from around the distributor plate. A little wipe, and we're nearly there. A little bit of spray if you need. We're using a lubricant there, but be aware that whatever you use to clean will obviously potentially end up in your oil system. At this point we should also just check that there's an O-ring inside the groove here. Again, check that it's in good condition, and if there's any problems then we need to replace. Okay, and now to the main part of the sludge. Inside the bowl wall we have the sludge cake which is collected, and behind that a paper insert or a paper liner which is used to bring out all the contamination together. What we need to do is use your non-metallic device, get behind the paper insert, paper liner, and push all the way down the wall of the bowl. Turn it around and do the same on the other side. The paper liner should now just come away from the bowl wall. If you need, just slide the tool around the edge of the bowl. You can then use your hands if it's sticking a little bit. Use your tool again just to prise away from the bottom, and once loose we can then either slide the sludge out the top or remove the bowl in its entirety, leaving the sludge cake. We now have a clean bowl wall. A good idea here is to actually put some lubricant on your cloth. The cloth should be clean to avoid any particles going into your oil system, to try and get the bowl wall as clean as possible. You can continue to clean both sections of the distributor plate and the bowl wall until it's nice and shiny, and even wash it. When you've removed the top turbine, it's a very good idea just to check the top nozzles, that there's nothing blocking the top nozzles, and if you have compressed air available, the best thing to do is to just give it a blast on each of the 4 nozzles to make sure they're clear, like so. In the event that you actually need to remove the bowl discs, remember that it's not a normal cleaning operation, but if sludge goes into the bowl discs themselves, or there's some damage, you may need to remove the discs. In which case, start by removing the O-ring at the top of the bearing tube, being careful not to damage it on the thread. You can then slide the bowl discs up the grooves and off the top of the bearing tube. We have a locking nut here. We can then use our hook spanner just to undo in a clockwise direction the locking nut. Okay, and then we can lift off the bearing tube as well. So once the locking nut's removed, we can then remove the impeller. Now there may be some sludge, which means you'll need to use maybe a tool just to lift the impeller, especially if there's sludge inside, but then you can lift and remove the impeller off the bearing tube and the distributor plate, and it's all disassembled. First thing to do is to reassemble the top turbine. We place the mesh support, the inner mesh support first, then the outer mesh support, and then we put a new mesh inside. The meshes come as part of the minor cleaning kit and can be replaced. We then replace the turbine plate, lining up the holes, and we can then start to use our 3mm Allen key to tighten slightly. Before we fully tighten, however, it's a good idea to replace the O-ring if you've taken it out. Please use a little bit of grease or cleaned oil or some sort of lubricant to make the process a little bit easier. You can always use the back of the Allen key just to ensure the O-ring is fully down, and then you can continue to screw in the 8 screws holding down the top turbine. And we now have the top turbine assembled. We now move on to the bearing tube and the distributor plate. Again, when we replace the O-ring, use silicone grease or something similar. If we've removed the distributor impeller from the distributor plate, now is the time to replace. You need to make sure that the notch on the impeller locates into the groove at the base so it sits flush. You can then use the locking nut. Again, remembering this is a left-hand thread, we can tighten and use the hook spanner. We can now replace the bowl discs. If we take a few at a time, the grooves on the bowl discs can be slotted down the grooves of the bearing tube. All the bowl discs are now in place. The next step is to put the bearing tube O-ring on the top. Just grease again. Be careful that we don't damage the O-ring. We can use the hook spanner to get underneath if it helps, into the groove and just smooth round. One very important thing to check at this point is that the top of the discs are actually level with the step in the bearing tube. So if you can't see a gap, as in this situation, then it's absolutely fine. But if there's a gap between the top of the discs and the step, then you'll need to add additional discs to the top. The next step is to replace the cleaned bowl wall. We put over and secure. We then need to put a new paper liner, paper insert into the bowl wall. So this just helps the cleaning next time. And then we replace the top turbine. And push down. Nicely secure. The final stage is to replace the washer and the top cover nut. Again, turning anti-clockwise to tighten. We need to tighten up to ensure there's no leakages. So we take the spanners, make sure it's nice and tight. The top of the cover nut should be level with the top of the bearing tube assembly. And that completes the bowl reassembly. Once the bowl assembly is cleaned, we're now ready to reassemble. So we put the bowl assembly back over the spindle onto the body housing. Just check everything is spinning well, which it is. And then we can replace the cover assembly. Again, turn anti-clockwise to tighten. and replace the band clamp, which keeps the cover assembly and housing assembly together, and tighten clockwise until just hand tight. And that's the MP600 cleaned and serviced. That's it. Thanks for watching. I hope it's proved useful. If you've got any more queries, please refer to our installation and servicing manual, or don't hesitate to contact us here at Separator Spares International.